Candace Simpson's gloved hands moved in, careful, practiced circles across the glass surface of Han Jae-sung's desk. The Chicago skyline glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, 1,000 lights reflecting off Lake Michigan in the darkness. She shouldn't look at the papers. She never looked at the papers. In the 2 years she'd worked in the penthouse, she'd mastered the art of being invisible, polishing around confidential files, dusting near dangerous conversations, existing in the careful space between survival and exposure. But tonight, one particular document caught her eye. It wasn't the embossed letterhead or the rows of corporate signatures that made her breath stop. It was the language in Article 12, subsection 4C, words that sent recognition slicing through her chest like a blade, because she knew them. Words structured in the exact pattern that had incinerated her career 3 years ago. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She should step away. She should finish her work and retreat to the service quarters where she belonged, where safety lived in silence. But her eyes, honed by training she'd buried deep, traced the clause again and again. No, she breathed to the empty office. This isn't standard language. This is an execution. The door opened behind her. Candace's hand jerked, the polishing cloth slipping from her fingers and landing soundlessly on the Persian rug as Han Jae-sung himself entered. 6'1" of lethal precision, dressed in a charcoal suit cut with the kind of perfection that whispered power in 3 languages. His eyes dark, calculating, the kind that had watched empires crumble without flinching, swept across the room and settled on her with absolute, dismissive indifference. She'd been working for him for 24 months, and he had never truly seen her. Not once. Until now, because Candace Simpson, who had rebuilt her entire existence on the foundation of being unremarkable, had just made the fatal mistake of lifting her eyes from the desk and looking directly at Han Jae-sung with an expression that didn't belong to a maid. It belonged to someone who understood exactly what that contract would do to him. "Sir." The word escaped before survival instinct could silence it. Her voice cracked, raw with 2 years of practiced invisibility shattering in a single moment. "This clause isn't just a trap." His hand, reaching casually for the Mont Blanc fountain pen beside the document, froze mid-motion. "It's a setup." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Han Jae-sung's expression, which had held the bored patience of a man reviewing another tedious business matter, emptied completely. What replaced it was something ancient and predatory, a stillness so complete it felt like the moment before a blade falls. His eyes locked onto hers with the precision of a rifle scope, and for the first time in 24 months, Candace Simpson was no longer invisible. She was terrifyingly, catastrophically seen. "Explain," he said softly. The word wasn't a request. And in that moment, as the city lights burned cold behind him and the contract lay poisoned between them, Candace understood with perfect clarity. She had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She had spoken. She had been noticed. And in Han Jae-sung's world, being noticed meant only 2 outcomes, protection or elimination. There would be no third option. Han Jae-sung didn't move toward her. He didn't need to. The weight of his attention alone pinned Candace against the desk like a physical force. He reached past her, his sleeve brushing her shoulder as he lifted the contract with deliberate slowness, his eyes never leaving her face. "You have 30 seconds to justify why you're still breathing," he said, his voice carrying the flat precision of a man who had delivered that ultimatum before. "Start with who taught a maid to read arbitration clauses." Candace's throat closed. Every instinct screamed at her to apologize, to bow her head and retreat into the safe armor of invisibility. But the contract in his hands was a loaded gun, and silence would pull the trigger just as surely as speaking had. "I'm not." Her voice cracked. She forced steel into it. "I wasn't always a maid. My name is Candace Simpson. 3 years ago, I was a senior financial analyst at Morrison Keyes International." His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. "Before they destroyed you." It wasn't a question. "Before they framed me for securities fraud and made sure I'd never work in finance again." The words tasted like ash. "That contract you're holding? Article 12, subsection 4, paragraph C. It's not a standard indemnity clause. It's a unilateral liability transfer mechanism disguised as mutual protection language." Han Jae-sung's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Explain it in terms I can use. The moment you sign, every transaction processed through that investment vehicle becomes your personal criminal liability, not the fund manager's. They've structured it so that if when the SEC or FinCEN investigates, The paper trail leads directly to you as the principal guarantor, not them. You. She pointed at the signature line with a trembling finger. Clause 4, quote, AE waives your right to corporate veil protection and establishes you as the de facto beneficial owner of any illicit proceeds. In plain terms, sir, they're not investing your money. They're making you the legal scapegoat for their money laundering operation. The silence that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. Han Jae-sung lowered the contract slowly, his eyes scanning the clause she'd indicated. She watched his face, watched the moment comprehension hit, watched the muscle in his jaw flex with barely contained rage. When he looked up at her again, the casual indifference had burned away completely, replaced by something far more dangerous. You recognized the language, he said quietly. This specific structure. Yes. Candace met his gaze. Too far gone now to retreat. Because Morrison Keyes used the same framework when they set me up. I know their signature. I know their lawyers. And I know exactly what happens to people who sign contracts written by Daniel Rothstein and Marissa Chen. Han Jae-sung set the contract down with surgical precision. He studied her for a long moment, and Candace couldn't tell if she was looking at her executioner or her only chance at salvation. How long have you been cleaning my office, Miss Simpson? 24 months. And in 24 months, you've never spoken a word beyond yes, sir, and good evening. His head tilted fractionally. Why break your silence tonight? Candace's hands were shaking openly now, but she didn't look away. Because that contract isn't just a trap, Mr. Han. It's a setup, and I've watched too many people sign their own execution orders to let it happen again. Not even to you. The city lights glittered cold and indifferent behind him as Han Jae-sung made his decision. Han Jae-sung moved to the bar cart without a word, pouring 2 fingers of whiskey into a crystal tumbler. He didn't offer her one. The amber liquid caught the light as he turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. Sit, he commanded, gesturing to the leather chair across from his desk. Candace hesitated. In 24 months, she had never sat in that chair, had never been invited into the inner sanctum of his professional space as anything other than furniture to be worked around, but the edge in his voice left no room for refusal. She sat, spine rigid, hands clasped in her lap to hide their trembling. Han Jae-sung settled into his own chair with predatory ease, studying her over the rim of his glass. Morrison Keyes International. I know the name. Boutique investment advisory, white shoe pedigree, clients who prefer their wealth management discreet. His eyes narrowed. 3 years ago, there was a scandal. A whistleblower exposed a multi-billion-dollar Ponzi scheme hidden in their offshore portfolios. The SEC came down like a hammer. I was the whistleblower. The words felt like swallowing glass. And yet you're the one who disappeared into domestic work while Morrison Keyes is still operating at full capacity. He set down his glass with deliberate precision. Tell me how that mathematics works, Miss Simpson. Candace's nails dug into her palms. She'd spent 3 years running from this story, burying it under layers of false names and fabricated employment histories. But Han Jae-sung wasn't asking. He was extracting, the way a surgeon removes a bullet with or without anesthetic. I was 26 when I made senior analyst, youngest in the firm's history. Her voice came out hollow, rehearsed from the 1,000 times she'd relived it in nightmares. I specialized in forensic accounting for high net worth clients. 6 months into a routine portfolio audit for a pension fund, I found the discrepancies. Small at first, wire transfers that didn't reconcile. Offshore entities with circular ownership structures. When I pulled the thread, the entire scheme unraveled. How much? $4.7 billion across 18 years. Han Jae-sung's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the armrest. And you reported it through internal channels, like an idiot. The bitterness in her laugh surprised even her. I went to my direct supervisor, then to the managing partners. I documented everything, showed them the forensic trail, the falsified statements, the shell companies. I thought I was protecting the firm from criminal liability. She met his eyes. I didn't understand that the managing partners were the architects, that I'd just walked into the boardroom and accused the wolves of eating the sheep. They turned it on you. Within 72 hours, evidence appeared in my personnel file. Fabricated emails showing I'd solicited kickbacks from offshore entities, bank statements for accounts I'd never opened, a paper trail that made me look like the mastermind, not the whistleblower. Candace's voice dropped to something raw and broken. My own forensic methodology turned into a weapon against me. They were brilliant. They made it look like I'd manufactured the entire scandal to cover my own theft. The SEC believed them. Everyone believed them. She forced the words past the tightness in her throat. Morrison Keyes had 50 years of institutional credibility. I was a 26-year-old black woman with student debt and no family connections. The SEC dropped their investigation and indicted me instead. I spent my life savings on legal defense and lost anyway. No jail time, but professional annihilation. Every firm in the industry blacklisted me. I couldn't get work as a receptionist at a used car dealership, let alone in finance. Han Jae-sung rose from his chair and retrieved the contract from his desk, holding it up to the light. And this document. You said you recognized their signature. Candace's hands clenched. Daniel Rothstein structured the language. I'd recognize his legal fingerprints anywhere. He always buries the poison pill in subordinate clauses with cross-referenced definitions. And Marissa Chen negotiated the terms. She has a tell. She front-loads protective language to create the illusion of bilateral protection, then negates it through mandatory arbitration requirements. She pointed at the signature blocks. Those are their names. Right there. Morrison Keyes International is setting you up exactly the way they set me up. And if you sign that contract, Mr. Han, you'll be just as destroyed as I was. Except you won't survive it with just a ruined career. You'll survive it with a life sentence. The silence stretched between them like a blade, sharp and unforgiving, as Han Jae-sung stared at the signatures that had condemned them both. Han Jae-sung set the contract down with the care one might use handling a live grenade. He walked to the windows, hands clasped behind his back, his silhouette framed against the glittering chaos of Chicago's skyline. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a verdict being handed down. 3 years ago, you saved a pension fund from collapse. You protected thousands of retirees from financial ruin. And for that act of professional integrity, they branded you a criminal and erased your existence. He turned to face her, and something in his expression had shifted, something cold and calculating and utterly merciless. Tonight, you saved me from signing my own execution warrant. You risked everything, your safety, your invisibility, your life, to warn someone you had every reason to let destroy himself. Candace's breath caught. She couldn't read where this was going, couldn't tell if she was about to be thanked or eliminated for knowing too much. Do you believe in debts, Miss Simpson? Sir? Debts. Obligations. The kind that demand payment regardless of convenience or cost. Han Jae-sung moved closer, his dark eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her feel transparent. You saved my empire tonight. More than that, you saved my freedom, possibly my life. In my world, such a debt cannot go unpaid. I don't want money, Candace said quickly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. I couldn't let them do it again. I couldn't watch another person sign away their future to those monsters. I know. His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Which is precisely why I'm about to make you an offer that will terrify you. He moved to his desk and pressed a button on his phone. Cancel my 8 o'clock. And get me everything we have on Morrison Keyes International financials, corporate structure, client lists, litigation history. I want it on my desk in 1 hour. The voice on the other end confirmed without question. Han Jae-sung returned his attention to Candace, who sat frozen in the chair, her mind racing to catch up with what was happening. You spent 3 years hiding from the people who destroyed you, working in my home, cleaning my office, existing in the margins of your own extraordinary mind, because you believed survival meant silence. He leaned against his desk, arms crossed. I'm offering you something different. Not safety through invisibility, but safety through absolute protection. I don't understand. Then let me be clear. His voice dropped to something deadly and sure. Morrison Keyes made a critical error tonight. They attempted to weaponize their legal expertise against the wrong target, and in doing so, they revealed their methodology to someone who not only understands it but has intimate knowledge of their operations. He paused, letting the words sink in. You, Miss Simpson. Candace's heart hammered against her ribs. What are you saying? I'm saying that as of this moment, you are no longer my maid. You are my covert strategic advisor. You will have full access to my legal team, my financial resources, and my protection. Complete protection, the kind that ensures Morrison Keyes can't touch you, can't threaten you, can't even find you unless I want them to. His eyes glittered with something primal and vengeful. And in exchange, you're going to help me do something you've dreamed about for 3 years. What's that? Destroy them. The words landed like a death sentence. Not just exposure, not just criminal charges. I want Morrison Keyes International dismantled brick by brick, their partners prosecuted, their assets seized, their reputation incinerated so thoroughly that their name becomes a cautionary tale in every business school for the next 50 years. He straightened, his posture radiating controlled violence. You showed them mercy once. You gave them the opportunity to do the right thing, and they crucified you for it. I'm offering you the chance to return the favor. With interest. Candace stared at him, her mind reeling. Every instinct told her this was dangerous, reckless, impossible. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, something she'd thought had died in a courtroom 3 years ago. The part of her that believed in justice. The part that had once been brilliant and fearless and unafraid to stand against the darkness. Why? The word came out broken. Why would you risk this for me? Han Jae-sung's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Because I recognize the look in your eyes, Miss Simpson. The same look I see in my mirror every morning. You were betrayed by people you trusted. You were punished for doing the right thing. You've spent years surviving in exile, watching lesser people prosper while you scrub floors. His voice dropped to something raw and honest. I know what it means to want revenge, and I know what it means to have the power to take it. The question is, do you have the courage to step back into the light? The city sprawled beneath them, a million lights burning in the darkness, and Candace Simpson stood at the edge of a choice that would either save her or destroy what little remained of her carefully constructed invisibility. Yes, she whispered, and the word felt like resurrection. The files arrived in less than 40 minutes. Han Jae-sung's head of intelligence, a severe woman named Park Min-ji, who looked at Candace with the assessing gaze of someone calculating threat levels, wheeled in a cart stacked with bankers' boxes and a locked briefcase containing digital drives. She departed without a word, leaving only the faint scent of expensive perfume and unspoken questions. Han Jae-sung gestured for Candace to join him at the conference table that occupied the far corner of his office. The polished surface reflected the city lights like a black mirror as he began extracting folders, each one labeled with dates spanning back nearly 2 decades. My people are thorough, he said, his tone carrying a hint of satisfaction. When I ask for everything, I mean everything. Candace's hands trembled as she opened the first file. Morrison Keys International, founded 1987. She recognized the corporate history, the glowing press releases, the photographs of the founding partners, shaking hands with senators and CEOs. But as she turned the pages, the narrative began to crack. Litigation settlements, Han Jae-sung said quietly, pointing to a section highlighted in yellow. Sealed court records, 17 cases over 12 years, all settled with non-disclosure agreements and confidential monetary terms. He slid another folder across the table. SEC inquiries that went nowhere, FinCEN investigations that stalled, whistleblower complaints that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. Candace's stomach turned as she read the names. Marcus Chen, 2011. Alleged securities fraud. Charges dropped. Elena Rodriguez, 2013. Alleged embezzlement, settled out of court. David Okonkwo, 2015. Alleged insider trading, career destroyed. The pattern repeated like a malignant heartbeat: accusations, investigations, sudden reversals, professional annihilation for the accusers. 7, she breathed, her voice barely audible. There were 7 people before me. 8, actually. Han Jae-sung opened the briefcase and extracted a tablet, pulling up a confidential report marked with security clearances Candace didn't want to know how he'd obtained. The first one was in 2009. Junior associate named Timothy Brennan. He discovered irregularities in client trust accounts and reported them to the State Bar Association. He turned the screen toward her. 3 weeks later, he was found dead in his apartment. Official ruling: suicide by overdose. The air left Candace's lungs. They killed him. The police report is suspiciously clean. No follow-up investigation. The bar complaint was sealed and expunged. Han Jae-sung's expression was granite. But 6 months after his death, Morrison Keys received a capital injection of $40 million from an offshore entity with ties to the pension fund Brennan had been investigating. The timeline is suggestive. Candace's hands shook as she pulled the next file toward her. The faces stared up at her from employment records and LinkedIn profiles: men and women who had been brilliant, ethical, ambitious, people who had believed the system would protect them for doing the right thing. Every single one of them had been systematically destroyed, careers ruined, reputations incinerated, lives dismantled with surgical precision. They're not just corrupt, she said, her voice hollow with dawning horror. They're a machine. A system designed to identify threats, neutralize them, and profit from the chaos they create in the process, which means they're organized, methodical, and deeply embedded. Han Jae-sung closed the tablet with deliberate care. Morrison Keys doesn't just serve wealthy clients, Miss Simpson. They serve clients who need their crimes sanitized and their enemies eliminated. They're not an investment advisory firm. They're a professional cleanup operation for the elite. Candace thought of the contract on his desk. The poison pill clause that would have made Han Jae-sung the legal scapegoat for millions in laundered money. And I walked into their boardroom 3 years ago like a lamb volunteering for slaughter. You survived. His dark eyes found hers. 8 people reported Morrison Keys for criminal activity. 7 had their lives destroyed. 1 died. And yet you're still breathing, still thinking, still dangerous to them. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to something fierce and urgent. Do you understand what that makes you? A loose end, a threat they underestimated. Han Jae-sung's hand moved across the files like a general surveying a battlefield. They made you vanish into obscurity because they believed silence would be enough. They didn't count on you landing in my home. They didn't count on their own arrogance leading them to try the exact same scheme twice. His smile was sharp enough to cut, and they certainly didn't count on you having the courage to speak up again. Candace stared at the faces in the files, the ghosts of Morrison Keys's past victims, people who had died or been destroyed for the same sin she'd committed. Telling the truth, the weight of it pressed against her chest like a physical force. They have senators on their client list, federal judges, corporate executives. They've been operating for 35 years with complete impunity. She looked up at Han Jae-sung, and for the first time since entering his office, real fear crept into her voice. How do we fight something that powerful? Han Jae-sung gathered the files with meticulous care, stacking them in a neat pile between them. When he met her eyes again, his expression carried the cold certainty of a man who had waged war before and won. The same way you fight any empire, Miss Simpson. You find its foundation, identify the fractures, and apply pressure until the entire structure collapses. He placed his hand flat on top of the files. And we start by making sure you're somewhere they can never reach you. Because the moment Morrison Keys realizes you're not just alive but actively working against them, you become the most dangerous person in their world. The city lights flickered beyond the windows like distant stars, and Candace understood with terrible clarity that she had just signed up for a war that would end in either her complete vindication or her final destruction. Han Jae-sung stood and moved to a concealed panel in the wall, pressing his palm against what appeared to be solid mahogany. The panel slid open silently, revealing a private elevator. "Come with me," he said, his tone brooking no argument. Candace rose on unsteady legs, still wearing the black uniform dress and white apron that had been her armor for 2 years. She followed him into the elevator, watching as he pressed his thumb to a biometric scanner. The doors closed, and they descended in silence broken only by the soft hum of machinery. When the doors opened, Candace found herself in a secure sublevel she hadn't known existed. The space was clinical and efficient, reinforced walls, multiple locked doors, surveillance monitors displaying every angle of the penthouse above. Han Jae-sung led her through a corridor to a private suite, opening the door to reveal a bedroom that looked nothing like servant quarters. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked an interior courtyard. Silk curtains framed a king-sized bed, and a walk-in closet stood open, revealing rows of professional attire. "This is your residence now," Han Jae-sung said, his voice matter-of-fact. "Biometric access only. The entire level is off-grid, no digital footprint, no building records, completely invisible to external surveillance. Morrison Keys could tear apart every database in the city and never find evidence you're here." Candace stared at the room, her mind struggling to process the transition from Maid's quarters to protected fortress. "I don't understand." "This is necessary." He moved to the closet and gestured to the clothing. "You can't operate as my strategic advisor dressed like staff. Tomorrow morning you'll meet with my personal tailor. For tonight, I've had several options prepared in your size." She approached the closet slowly, her fingers brushing against fabric that probably cost more than she'd earned in 6 months of cleaning. Charcoal suits with razor-sharp lines, silk blouses in jewel tones, Italian leather shoes arranged on custom shelves. It was a wardrobe designed for someone who walked into boardrooms and commanded attention. "I haven't worn anything like this since." Her voice broke. "Since they took everything from you." Han Jae-sung's reflection appeared in the closet mirror behind her. "Morrison Keys didn't just destroy your career, Miss Simpson. They destroyed your identity. They forced you to become invisible because they believed a woman who couldn't be seen couldn't be dangerous. His eyes met hers in the glass. It's time to prove them catastrophically wrong. Candace selected a charcoal suit and disappeared into the adjoining bathroom. When she emerged 15 minutes later, the transformation was visceral. The maid's uniform lay discarded on the marble counter like a shed skin. The suit fit perfectly, tailored to emphasize competence rather than curves. The kind of armor powerful women wore into corporate warfare. She'd pulled her hair back into a sleek, professional bun and found minimal makeup in the bathroom drawers. Whoever had prepared this space had thought of everything. Han Jae-sung was standing by the windows when she returned, 2 glasses of whiskey in his hands. He turned, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of the woman she'd been before Morrison Keyes tried to erase her. "Better," he said simply, extending one of the glasses toward her. Candace accepted it, her fingers steady now. "I need to know something before we go any further." "Ask." "Why me?" The question she'd been holding back since he'd made his offer. "You have lawyers, accountants, intelligence operatives, people who could dissect Morrison Keyes without the baggage I bring, so why risk everything on someone they've already broken once?" Han Jae-sung took a slow sip of his whiskey, considering his answer with the care of a man who understood that words, once spoken, became contracts. 3 years ago, you stood in a boardroom full of men who could destroy you and told them the truth anyway. You sacrificed your career, your reputation, your entire future because you believed people deserved protection from predators. You didn't do it for money or recognition or advancement. You did it because it was right. He moved closer, his dark eyes intense. "In my world, Miss Simpson, that kind of moral courage is rarer than diamonds, and infinitely more valuable." "I was terrified," she admitted quietly. "I'm still terrified." "Good. Fear means you understand the stakes." He raised his glass in a subtle toast. "But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite it. You proved that tonight when you broke your silence to save someone you had every reason to let fall. You proved it 3 years ago when you exposed Morrison Keyes the first time. And you'll prove it again when we dismantle them piece by piece." Candace met his gaze over the rim of her glass, and something shifted in the air between them. Not quite trust, that would take time, but the foundation of something equally powerful. Recognition. 2 people who had been betrayed, who understood the cost of principle, who were willing to wage war against an enemy that had seemed untouchable. "I formally accept your offer, Mr. Han." Her voice was steady now, the voice of the analyst she'd been before the world tried to silence her. "I'll serve as your strategic advisor. I'll help you destroy Morrison Keyes. And I'll do it with every ounce of knowledge and skill they tried to bury." Han Jae-sung's smile was sharp and satisfied. "Then let's begin, Miss Simpson. We have an empire to dismantle." She took a sip of the whiskey, feeling its burn chase away the last remnants of the invisible woman she'd been forced to become, and stepped fully into the light of her resurrection. 3 months transformed the penthouse office into a war room. The elegant space that had once been designed for solitary power now hummed with collaborative intensity. Whiteboards covered in financial diagrams lined one wall. Legal precedents printed on heavy bond paper covered the conference table, and the scent of coffee and late nights hung perpetually in the air. Candace stood at the window in the pre-dawn darkness, reviewing the document on her tablet for what felt like the 1,000th time. Behind her, she heard Han Jae-sung's footsteps. She'd learned to recognize them over the past 90 days, the precise cadence of a man who moved through the world with absolute certainty. "You're up early," he observed, setting a cup of coffee beside her. He'd learned how she took it. Black, 2 sugars, strong enough to strip paint. "Section 14 still bothers me." She pulled up the clause in question, highlighting the language that had kept her awake for the past 3 nights. "The indemnification provision looks clean on first read, but if Morrison Keyes runs it through their standard due diligence protocol, they'll spot the recursive reference in subsection C." Han Jae-sung moved closer, reading over her shoulder. The proximity no longer made her nervous. They'd spent too many 18-hour days working in tandem for casual boundaries to survive. What if we embed it in the dispute resolution framework instead? Cross-reference it through the arbitration election clause. Candace's fingers flew across the screen, restructuring the language. That could work. It's technically a procedural provision, which means their contracts team will skim it rather than scrutinize it. But we need to make sure the trigger mechanism is airtight. She pulled up a separate window, comparing their draft to 6 other investment agreements Morrison Keyes had executed in the past 2 years. They use a standard template. If we mirror their language in the first 12 sections, they'll assume the rest follows their house style. Trojan horse methodology. Han Jae-sung's voice carried a note of satisfaction. Hide the weapon inside something that looks familiar. Exactly. Candace pulled up a flowchart she'd created, tracing the legal cascade their contract would trigger once signed. The beauty is that everything in our agreement is technically enforceable. There's nothing illegal, nothing that would raise red flags with regulators. But the liability structure flows backward instead of forward. Every transaction they process through our investment vehicle becomes their personal criminal exposure, not yours. The same mechanism they tried to use against me, with one critical difference. Candace highlighted a section in purple. Their contract was designed to be discovered. Eventually, they wanted law enforcement to find you holding the bag. Our contract is designed to be invisible until it's far too late. By the time they realize what they've signed, they'll have already processed enough questionable transactions to bury themselves. Han Jae-sung studied the flowchart with the intensity of a general reviewing battle plans. How long until they trigger the liability cascade? Based on their historical transaction volume? 6 to 8 weeks after signing. Candace pulled up another document, a forensic analysis of Morrison Key's offshore activity over the past 5 years. They move money every 72 hours like clockwork. High net worth clients who need their wealth sanitized, corporations that need their balance sheets adjusted, politicians who need their campaign contributions laundered. The moment they start processing funds through our vehicle, every transaction creates prosecutable exposure under RICO statutes, FinCEN regulations, and the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And the arbitration clause ensures they can't escape through litigation. Better than that. Candace's smile was cold and precise. The arbitration clause they think protects them actually waives their right to attorney-client privilege for any disputes arising from the agreement, which means every communication with their lawyers becomes discoverable evidence the moment enforcement agencies get involved. Han Jae-sung set down his coffee and turned to face her fully. Over the past 3 months, she'd watched him shift from viewing her as a rescued asset to treating her as an intellectual equal. They'd spent countless hours in this office, dissecting Morrison Keyes' methodology, studying their patterns, building a trap so elegant it bordered on art. You've thought of everything. I've had 3 years to think about nothing else. Candace closed the tablet and met his gaze. Every night in the maid's quarters, I ran scenarios in my head, how I would have defended myself differently, what evidence I should have preserved, how I could have anticipated their moves before they destroyed me. Her voice dropped to something raw and honest. This contract isn't just a legal instrument, Mr. Han. It's 3 years of rage and brilliant, converted into weaponized precision. Stop calling me Mr. Han. His tone was quiet but firm. We've been working side by side for 3 months. We've built something that could collapse a 35-year empire. I think we're past formalities. Jae-sung, she said, testing the intimacy of his given name. Better. He moved back to the conference table, spreading out the latest financial intelligence his team had gathered. Minji's sources confirm that Daniel Rothstein is actively seeking new investment partnerships. He's been reaching out to high-net-worth individuals with connections to offshore banking. Our profile fits perfectly. Candace joined him at the table, her mind already racing through the next phase of their plan. We need to make first contact within the next 2 weeks. Any longer and they might lock in with a different partner. Any sooner and we look desperate. I'll have Minji arrange an introduction through a mutual connection. Someone whose reputation will make Morrison Keyes believe we're exactly the kind of client they specialize in: powerful, morally flexible, and willing to pay premium fees for discretion. Jae-sung's dark eyes met hers across the table. Are you ready for this? Once we make contact, there's no turning back. They'll start their due diligence on both of us. Candace thought of Timothy Brennan, found dead in his apartment, of 7 other people who had their lives systematically destroyed, of her own face in that courtroom 3 years ago, watching everything she'd built crumble to ashes. I've been ready for 3 years, she said, her voice steady and sure. Let's introduce Morrison Keyes to their own methodology, and let's make sure they never see it coming. The sun began to rise over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood, as 2 architects of vengeance finalized the blueprints for an empire's destruction. The city had gone quiet by the time Candace looked up from her laptop, her eyes burning from hours of screen time. It was past 2 in the morning, their 4th consecutive night, working until the early hours, fueled by coffee and the singular focus of people who understood the stakes. Across the table, Jae-sung was reviewing financial projections, his tie discarded hours ago, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows in a rare concession to exhaustion. "We should stop," Candace said, closing her laptop with a soft click. "We're going to miss something critical if we keep pushing through fatigue." Jae-sung looked up, and she caught something in his expression she hadn't seen before, a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. "You're right." He set down his pen with deliberate care and moved to the windows, staring out at the darkened skyline. "Do you know what I've built my entire empire on, Candace?" The use of her first name still sent a small current through her. "Control," she said quietly. "Control through isolation." His reflection in the glass looked like a ghost. "I learned early that trust is the most expensive commodity in my world. That loyalty can be purchased but never guaranteed. That the moment you allow someone close enough to matter, they become a weapon that can be used against you." He turned to face her, his expression unguarded in a way she'd never witnessed. "For 15 years, I've operated from that principle. I've built walls so high that even the people who work for me don't know who I am beneath the reputation." Candace rose from her chair, drawn toward him by something she couldn't name. "That's not isolation, that's survival." "Is there a difference?" His voice carried a bitter edge. "I have 100 people who would die on my command, and not one of them knows what keeps me awake at night. I have enough power to reshape this city, and no one to share it with. I've spent 15 years being untouchable, and the cost is that I'm also unreachable." She stopped a few feet away from him, close enough to see the shadows beneath his eyes, the tension in his jaw. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're the first person in 15 years who chose to stand beside me rather than behind me." His dark eyes found hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You didn't ask for my protection because you wanted to hide behind my power. You accepted it because you wanted to use your own. You don't flinch when I make decisions that would terrify most people. You don't defer to my judgment when you think I'm wrong. You treat me like an equal," Candace finished softly. "A person." The words landed between them like a confession. Someone who can be trusted with more than just orders and obedience. Someone who understands that power isn't just a sword to strike with. Sometimes it's a shield to protect what matters. Candace felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that what they'd built over the past 3 months extended far beyond strategic partnership. She'd watched him make ruthless decisions without hesitation, seen him exercise power that would make most people recoil, but she'd also seen him spend hours ensuring her safety, restructure his entire security protocol to protect her identity, listen to her ideas with respect that bordered on reverence. "I thought you were terrifying when I first spoke to you," she admitted. "The way you looked at me that night like you could decide whether I lived or died with a single word." "I could have." His honesty was brutal and oddly tender. "Should have, by every operational principle I've ever followed. You knew too much. You'd seen too much. The smart move was elimination. But you didn't. Because I recognized something in you that I'd forgotten existed in myself." He moved closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. The belief that some things are worth risking everything for. That justice isn't just a word people use to feel noble about their revenge. That the right thing can be worth more than the safe thing. Candace's heart hammered against her ribs. "Jae-sung, I need you to understand something." His voice dropped to something raw and urgent. "This partnership we've built, it's not just professional convenience. You've become the one person in my world I trust completely. The only person who knows who I am beneath everything I've constructed. And if Morrison Keyes succeeds, if they find a way to eliminate you before we finish this, I won't just lose a strategic advisor." His hand lifted, fingertips barely brushing her cheek. "I'll lose the only person who makes me remember what it feels like to be human." The confession hung between them, vulnerable and devastating. Candace found herself reaching up, her hand covering his where it rested against her face. "You're not going to lose me. We're going to finish this together. We're going to destroy them, vindicate me, and walk away from the ashes as partners." "Partners," he repeated, and something in the word carried weight beyond its professional definition. She didn't know who moved first, whether she rose on her toes or he bent down, but suddenly his mouth was on hers, fierce and desperate and utterly consuming. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling her closer, and she pressed against him with 3 months of building tension finally finding release. The kiss tasted like coffee and whiskey, and the particular intimacy of two people who had spent countless hours learning each other's minds before ever touching. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Jae-sung rested his forehead against hers. "This is dangerous," he murmured. "Everything we're doing is dangerous," Candace countered, her voice unsteady. At least this danger is one we're choosing. His arms tightened around her, and for the first time since she'd known him, Han Jae-sung looked like something other than an untouchable force. He looked like a man who had found something worth protecting more than his own invulnerability. "Then let's choose it together," he said, and kissed her again as Chicago slept beneath them, unaware that two people had just forged a bond that would either save them both or consume them entirely. The meeting took place in Morrison Keyes' conference room on the 42nd floor of the Hancock Tower, all polished mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows designed to make clients feel simultaneously important and insignificant. Candace watched through the secure video feed from Jae-sung's penthouse, her heart a steady drumbeat of anticipation and rage. She'd insisted on staying hidden, her presence would shatter the entire operation, but watching Daniel Rothstein's face on the screen felt like staring at the architect of her own destruction. He looked exactly as she remembered, silver hair styled with expensive precision, bespoke suit that probably cost $15,000, the kind of practiced smile that suggested warmth while delivering absolutely none. Beside him sat Marissa Chen, sharp-featured and immaculate, her eyes calculating as they reviewed the documents spread before them. Jae-sung sat across the table from them, every inch the powerful client they'd been courting for 6 weeks. Minji had done her work flawlessly, the introduction through a Swiss banker, the carefully leaked information about Jae-sung's need for sophisticated offshore investment structures, the subtle suggestions that he had money requiring discretion. Morrison Keyes had pursued him like sharks, scenting blood in the water. "The structure is elegant," Rothstein said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man who believed he controlled every room he entered. "The offshore vehicles provide optimal tax efficiency while maintaining complete confidentiality. Our firm has been executing these arrangements for 35 years without a single regulatory complication." Candace's hands clenched into fists. "Without a single regulatory complication, because you've been destroying anyone who tried to expose you," she thought viciously. Jae-sung nodded with appropriate gravitas. "Your reputation for discretion is precisely why I sought your services. My business interests require partners who understand that certain transactions benefit from creative structuring." Marissa Chen's smile sharpened. This was the language they understood, the careful euphemisms of wealthy clients who needed their crimes sanitized. "We pride ourselves on providing comprehensive solutions for clients with complex needs. The arbitration provisions in Section 14 ensure that any disputes remain entirely private." "I noticed those provisions." Jae-sung's tone was perfectly calibrated, interested but not concerned. Exactly the response of a client who believed arbitration clauses were standard protection rather than the weapon Candace had forged them into. "My legal team found them acceptable." Candace had to suppress a bitter laugh. "Your legal team found them acceptable because we designed them to look exactly like every other arbitration clause you've ever seen. They didn't notice that this one flows backward, that it waives your protections instead of establishing them." Rothstein pulled the signature pages closer, his Mont Blanc pen already in hand. "Before we finalize, I want to confirm the initial capital commitment. $50 million, with quarterly reviews for potential expansion?" "Correct." Jae-sung's expression revealed nothing, with the understanding that certain transactions may require expedited processing outside normal banking channels. Naturally, Rothstein's smile was pure predatory satisfaction. He'd heard exactly what he wanted to hear, a client with dirty money and no moral qualms about how it got cleaned. "We have established protocols for time-sensitive matters. Your funds will be handled with absolute discretion." Marissa Chen signed first, her signature a flourish of confidence. She slid the documents to Rothstein, who reviewed the final page with the practiced eye of someone who had executed thousands of contracts. Candace held her breath, watching for any sign of hesitation, any indication that he might scrutinize the language more carefully. But greed and arrogance were powerful blinders. Rothstein saw a $50 million client with promises of more to come. He saw a man who fit perfectly into Morrison Keyes' specialty niche, powerful, morally flexible, desperate for the kind of services that generated enormous fees and required permanent silence. He saw exactly what they'd designed him to see. Daniel Rothstein signed his name with the same pen he'd probably used to destroy 8 people's lives. The trap snapped shut with the soft scratch of ink on paper. Jae-sung stood, extending his hand across the table. "I look forward to a long and mutually beneficial partnership." "As do we." Rothstein shook his hand with the confidence of a man who believed he'd just acquired another wealthy victim. "We'll have the investment vehicles established within 48 hours. You can begin transferring funds by the end of the week." Candace watched them exchange final pleasantries, watched Rothstein and Chen gather their documents with satisfied smiles, watched them walk out of the conference room believing they'd just executed another perfect scheme. They had no idea they'd just signed their own arrest warrants. No idea that every transaction they processed through Jae-sung's investment vehicle would create prosecutable evidence of money laundering, RICO violations, and conspiracy. No idea that the arbitration clause they'd barely glanced at had legally stripped away every protection their own lawyers had spent decades constructing. The video feed went dark as Jae-sung left the building. Candace sat in the silence of the penthouse, her entire body trembling with the magnitude of what they'd just accomplished. 3 years of rage, 3 months of meticulous planning, and one signature that would bring an empire crashing down. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jae-sung. "It's done." They never saw it coming. Candace typed her response with steady fingers. "Now we wait for them to hang themselves with our rope." She walked to the windows and looked out over the city where Morrison Keyes had once destroyed her. Somewhere in that glittering sprawl, Daniel Rothstein and Marissa Chen were congratulating themselves on acquiring another lucrative client. They were probably already planning how to exploit him, how to structure their schemes to maximize profit while minimizing their own exposure. They had no idea that in 6 to 8 weeks, their entire world would collapse. That federal agents would be serving warrants. That every transaction they processed would become evidence. That the woman they'd erased 3 years ago had just engineered their complete destruction using their own methodology as the weapon. Candace smiled, cold and satisfied, as the sun set over Chicago. The countertrap was sprung. Now came the reckoning. 7 weeks later, the first domino fell at 6:47 a.m., when federal agents executed simultaneous search warrants at Morrison Keyes International's offices, Daniel Rothstein's Lake Forest estate, and Marissa Chen's Gold Coast penthouse. Candace watched the news coverage from Jae-sung's office, his arm around her shoulders as cable networks scrambled to cover the breaking story. Helicopters circled the Hancock Tower, capturing footage of agents carrying boxes of evidence while employees were escorted from the building in stunned silence. Federal prosecutors have unsealed a massive indictment against Morrison Keyes International, the news anchor announced, barely containing her excitement. The charges include money laundering, RICO violations, securities fraud, and conspiracy spanning nearly 2 decades. Sources say the evidence comes from an ongoing investment relationship that triggered automatic regulatory reporting requirements. Candace felt Jae-sung's hand tighten on her shoulder. They'd watched Morrison Keyes process transactions through their investment vehicle for 49 days, exactly long enough to establish an undeniable pattern of criminal activity. Every wire transfer, every offshore movement, every suspicious transaction had been automatically documented through the reporting mechanisms Candace had embedded in the contract. Morrison Keyes had been so focused on exploiting Jae-sung that they'd never noticed they were creating their own evidence trail. Her phone buzzed with a call from the number she'd been expecting. Assistant Director Patricia Vance, Financial Crimes Division, FBI. Candace had reached out 3 weeks ago through carefully anonymized channels, providing just enough information to make the Bureau interested. Now they wanted more. "Miss Simpson," Vance's voice was crisp and professional. "I think it's time we met in person." The meeting happened 2 days later in a secure federal facility, with Jae-sung's lawyers present and immunity agreements already negotiated. Candace walked into the conference room wearing a charcoal suit and the quiet confidence of someone who held all the cards. Vance sat across from her, flanked by 2 prosecutors and a forensic accountant who looked at Candace with something approaching awe. "You built a nearly perfect evidence collection mechanism," Vance said without preamble. "Every transaction Morrison Keyes processed through your investment vehicle created documented proof of money laundering and RICO violations. The arbitration clause waived their attorney-client privilege. The liability transfer provisions made them personally responsible for every criminal act. It's the most sophisticated prosecutorial gift I've seen in 20 years. It's also legal revenge," Candace said quietly. 3 years ago, Morrison Keyes framed me for the exact crimes they were committing. They destroyed my career, my reputation, my entire life. I want immunity, and I want my testimony on record. Every single thing they did to me, every piece of evidence they fabricated, every person they destroyed before me, I want it documented and public." Vance slid a document across the table. "Full immunity in exchange for your cooperation and testimony. You'll be listed as a confidential informant in the investigation, but if this goes to trial, you'll need to testify publicly." "Good." Candace signed without hesitation. "I want them to see my face when their empire collapses. I want them to know exactly who dismantled them." The media explosion happened 48 hours later when the Justice Department held a press conference. Standing beside Patricia Vance, Candace Simpson, former financial analyst, former Maid, current architect of one of the largest white-collar prosecutions in a decade, told her story to a packed room of journalists. She detailed Morrison Keyes' decades-long pattern of destruction, named the 8 victims who had been silenced before her, presented evidence of systematic fraud that made the initial Ponzi scheme look almost quaint by comparison. 3 years ago, I reported criminal activity and was punished for it, Candace said, her voice steady and clear. I was framed, destroyed, and erased. Morrison Keyes believed they could silence me permanently. They were wrong. She looked directly into the cameras, knowing Rothstein and Chen would be watching from their holding cells. I spent 3 years preparing for this moment. Learning, planning, building a trap so comprehensive that when they walked into it, there would be no escape. Justice delayed is not justice denied. It's justice perfected, the headlines wrote themselves. Legal mastermind brings down corrupt investment firm. Former whistleblower orchestrates perfect revenge. The maid who destroyed an empire. Cable news ran endless analysis of her strategy, legal experts marveling at the elegance of her countertrap. And within 72 hours, Candace Simpson had transformed from an erased victim into a vindicated hero. Job offers arrived by the dozen major law firms, financial institutions, government agencies, all wanting the woman who had outsmarted Morrison Keyes. But Candace ignored them all. She'd already accepted the only position that mattered. The final domino fell when Daniel Rothstein and Marissa Chen, faced with overwhelming evidence and no viable defense, accepted plea agreements. 15 years for Rothstein, 12 for Chen. Asset forfeiture. Permanent disbarment. Morrison Keyes International dissolved. Its client list seized. Its legacy reduced to a cautionary tale in business ethics courses. Candace stood outside the federal courthouse as the sentencing was announced. Jae Sung beside her in a gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes without requiring words. Reporters shouted questions, but she only offered a single statement. This is what happens when you underestimate someone you tried to erase. This is what happens when you forget that silence is not the same as surrender. And this is what happens when you give a brilliant woman 3 years to plan your destruction. She turned away from the cameras and found Jae Sung watching her with an expression of fierce pride and unmistakable love. Ready to go home? He asked quietly. Candace took his hand, feeling the weight of 3 years finally lift from her shoulders. She was visible now, powerful, vindicated, and absolutely, finally free. Yes, she said. Let's go home. The press conference happened 1 week later in the penthouse that had once been Candace's prison and had become her fortress. Jae Sung stood beside her, impeccably dressed, as she announced her new position. General Counsel for Han Enterprises' legitimate business operations, a portfolio of real estate developments, technology investments, and international trade ventures that required exactly the kind of brilliant, ethical oversight she'd always been meant to provide. Miss Simpson brings unparalleled expertise and uncompromising integrity to this role, Jae Sung told the assembled journalists, his tone professional but his eyes carrying a warmth only she could interpret. Her courage and brilliance have already proven invaluable. I'm honored to have her as my partner in building something that operates entirely in the light. The questions came fast and sharp, but Candace handled them with the same precision she'd used to dismantle Morrison Keyes. Yes. She was fully licensed to practice law again. The state bar had expedited her reinstatement, after the federal investigation vindicated her completely. Yes, she understood the irony of working for someone with Jae Sung's reputation. And yes, she was confident that his legitimate enterprises would benefit from her commitment to operating within legal boundaries. What she didn't tell them was that Han Jae Sung had been quietly divesting from his more questionable operations for months, restructuring his empire into something that could survive scrutiny, that her influence had already reshaped his business philosophy, that the man who had once ruled through fear and isolation was learning to lead through loyalty and trust. The reporters finally left, and Candace found Jae Sung waiting for her in the office where she'd once cleaned his desk in terrified silence. The city sparkled beyond the windows, infinite and full of possibility. I have something for you, he said, pulling a small box from his pocket. For a breathless moment, Candace thought it might be a ring, but when he opened it, she found something even more significant, a biometric key card and a set of traditional keys on a platinum ring, full access to the penthouse, legal ownership of the sub-level residence. And these, he held up the traditional keys, are to the Lake Geneva estate. Not as an employee or a guest, Candace. As a partner. As home. Her throat tightened with emotion she'd spent 3 years learning to suppress. Jae-sung, I love you. The words were simple and devastating. I love your brilliance, your courage, your absolute refusal to compromise your principles, even when it would have been easier. You didn't just save my life or help me avoid a trap. You reminded me what it means to be someone worth saving. He took her hands in his grip steady and sure. Build a future with me. Not just a professional partnership, but everything. A home, a life, a partnership where we're equals in every sense that matters. Candace looked at the man who had given her protection when she was invisible, respect when she found her voice, and love when she learned to trust again. She thought of the maid's uniform she'd discarded months ago, the woman she'd been forced to become, and the person she'd finally reclaimed. Yes, she said, rising on her toes to kiss him with the fierce certainty of someone who had walked through fire and emerged tempered into steel. Let's build something extraordinary together. He pulled her close, and as Chicago glittered beneath them like a promise, Candace Simpson, former victim, legal mastermind, general counsel, and beloved partner finally came home.